Welcome to my Bard story.
Hello and welcome. It's great to dive into another fascinating part of Scripture with you today.
Absolutely. Today, we're stepping back, way back, right into the world immediately after the Great Flood.
A pivotal moment. We're focusing on Genesis chapter 8, specifically verses 20 through 22.
Right. Noah's sacrifice right after getting off the ark, and maybe even more importantly, God's incredible response to it.
Exactly. This isn't just wrapping up the flood story. It's a massive turning point. We see this shift from, well, cataclysmic judgment to
grace and promises. A whole new setup, really.
precisely a profound display of grace and these enduring promises that shape everything afterwards.
And our mission today, well, it's especially for you listening, particularly if you're involved in pastoral ministry or studying theology.
We really want to dig deep into these verses, go beyond just a surface read. We'll be drawing on various translations and insights from some key international scholars and major commentaries.
Yeah, names you probably recognize, commentaries like the NAC, Word Biblical Commentary, IAPI, folks like Walton, Wenham, Hamilton. We want to pull out those really valuable nuggets.
The goal is to find those aha moments,
Yeah.
to really explore the theological weight here
Well,
and see how it can genuinely enrich your preaching, your teaching, your pastoral care.
so not just what happened, but really digging into why it matters so profoundly for our faith today. Ready to jump in?
Let's do it.
Okay, let's turn to our study note then. We'll start with Genesis 8, verse 20, reading from the NIV. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it.
So right away, this opening action is just huge. It's actually the first time the Bible explicitly mentions an altar, a mizbah.
Really? The very first time? What about Cain and Abel? They offered sacrifices.
They did offer sacrifices, yes, but the text never actually says they built an altar. So this highlights Noah's act as something foundational, something pioneering right after the flood.
Wow. And it wasn't something God told him to do at that moment.
No, that's what's striking. It seems entirely spontaneous. There's no record of a divine command saying, Noah, build an altar now. It's just this immediate, heartfelt outpouring of worship.
That's incredible. Just think stepping onto a completely new, cleansed earth, and the first impulse is worship. It says a lot.
It truly does. It speaks volumes about responding to divine deliverance.
So let's talk about the sacrifice itself. It mentions burnt offerings. The Hebrew is cho, right? What's significant about that specific type of offering?
Yes, the shuh. This is crucial. The defining characteristic of the burnt offering was that it was completely consumed by fire on the altar.
Completely. So not just a part of the animal.
Exactly, the entire animal. This signifies total dedication, complete surrender to God. Imagine the scene.
Yeah.
You've just survived global destruction, you're stepping out, and your first act is to symbolically give everything back to God.
Total surrender. Kenneth Matthews points this out, right? As a kind of model for how we should respond to God's salvation.
Yes, precisely. Matthews, in the NEC, sees this as a paradigm, a model of unreserved devotion. It's this picture of complete self-giving, acknowledging that life itself, everything, comes from God and belongs to God.
And Gordon Wenham adds another layer too, doesn't he? Beyond just gratitude.
He does. Wenham in the WBC highlights the obvious gratitude, of course, but he also suggests these possible undertones of atonement, seeking forgiveness.
Because even though judgment happens, sin is still present in the human heart.
Exactly. It's a recognition, perhaps, that humanity's fundamental problem hasn't just vanished with the floodwaters. So it's this really holistic response, thanksgiving for deliverance, but maybe also an acknowledgement of ongoing need of human brokenness.
That makes sense. A complex response to a complex situation. Now, the text is very specific. Noah took some of all the clean animals and clean birds. That detail feels important.
Oh, absolutely. It's far from random. It connects directly back, doesn't it? Back to Genesis 7.
Right. Before the flood even started, God told him to take 7 pairs of the clean animals into the ark.
Exactly. 7 pairs of the clean, only 2 of the unclean. Victor Hamilton, in the NICOT commentary, points this out as just profound divine foresight.
So God was already planning for this act of worship before the flood even ended.
It certainly seems so. God didn't just ensure survival. He sovereignly provided the very means, the right kind of means for proper worship immediately afterwards. It shows God's planning, his sovereignty in this whole event.
God providing the means for worship itself. That's quite something. What does that teach us then about how we prepare for worship? And how does Noah's specific obedience here contrast with, say, Cain's offering back in Genesis 4?
Well, it teaches us, I think, that worship from God's perspective isn't haphazard. It's intentional. It aligns with his revealed will and often his provision. God prepared these animals, and Noah obediently used them.
Which wasn't the case with Cain. The implication there was something wrong with his offering, or his heart, right?
Right. Genesis 4 implies a problem. Maybe the offering itself wasn't what God desired, or perhaps more fundamentally, Cain's attitude. His heart wasn't right. Noah's act here, using the clean animals God had specifically multiplied and preserved, sets this early standard.
So, acceptable worship involves a grateful, surrendered heart, using what God has provided according to his design.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's about giving back the best in the way he desires, acknowledging him as the ultimate source of everything, even the sacrifice itself.
Okay, let's move to verse 21. This is where we see God's direct response. Reading again from the NIV. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done."
Wow, so much packed in here. The divine response is just central. That phrase, the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, Wayrek, YHWH, honey, it's classic biblical language, isn't it?
Anthropomorphism, attributing human characteristics to God.
Exactly. It's a powerful sensory way to depict God's acceptance, his pleasure, his delight in Noah's sincere worship. We see this phrase pop up again and again in Leviticus for sacrifices God finds acceptable.
But what really stands out here is the next part. The Lord said in his heart.
Yes, that is absolutely pivotal. This isn't a negotiation. It's not God responding because Noah did something to earn it. It's an internal, unilateral decision, a profound act of sovereign grace bubbling up from within God himself.
Let's unpack that pleasing aroma idea a bit more. Obviously, God doesn't have a physical nose. What's the deeper theological meaning, especially when you compare it to how other ancient cultures viewed sacrifices?
You're right. It's purely metaphorical. It's not about God needing the smoke or the smell. It signifies divine acceptance, pleasure in the heart behind the offering. Alan Ross in the Cornerstone Commentary puts it well. It signals God's willingness to restore the relationship.
Restore the relationship fractured by sin. So it's about reconciliation.
Yes. And the contrast with pagan myths like the Gilgamesh epic is stark, isn't it?
Remind us about that, the gods in Gilgamesh.
Well, in that story, after their flood, the gods are depicted as, frankly, quite pathetic. They swarm like flies around the sacrifice, seemingly hungry and desperate, dependent on humans.
Wow, that's a very different picture.
Completely different. Nahum Sarna, in the JPS Torah commentary, really emphasizes how Genesis elevates Yahweh. He's transcendent, self-sufficient. He doesn't need the offering. He chooses to accept the worshiper's heart. His smelling the aroma and speaking in his heart just highlights his dignity, his sovereignty. His actions flow from his character, not from need.
That distinction is huge. Okay, but then comes the real head-scratcher, the paradox. God decides not to curse the ground again, not to destroy all life again, because, or as the NIV puts it, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood?
Yes.
That sounds almost exactly like the reason he sent the flood back in Genesis 6. How can the same reason lead to the opposite outcome? It seems contradictory.
It does seem contradictory on the surface, and this is where careful reading and understanding the Hebrew is just crucial. Scholars like John Wall and Gordon Wenham, they point out that the Hebrew word ki, often translated because or for, has a wider range of meaning.
Okay, like what?
Well, in this specific context, the strong consensus is that it should be understood concessively, meaning although or despite.
Okay, so reading it as, never again will I curse the ground, despite the fact that human hearts are still evil.
Exactly. That resolves the logical tension completely. God's decision isn't caused by human evil. It's an act of pure grace made in spite of it.
So God hasn't suddenly decided humans are better now. His assessment hasn't changed.
Not at all. He's still utterly realistic about the human condition. Genesis 6.5 stands. But what has changed is God's response, his policy, if you will.
He changes his response, not his diagnosis. That's profound.
It is. He seems to recognize that simply wiping out humanity didn't fix the root problem. Sin is still embedded in the human heart, even in Noah's family. So he adopts a new strategy.
A strategy of patience, long-suffering.
Yes. Instead of repeated, immediate total judgment, he chooses sustained commitment. Klaus Westermann calls this a deep transformation in God's interaction with humanity. And this commitment has two parts, right?
Right, verse 21 says, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, and never again will I destroy all living creatures, as I have done."
Two massive unilateral promises. They flow entirely from God's own gracious character, not from anything humans have done or will do. And they lay the foundation for absolutely everything that follows in redemptive history.
Okay, let's look at the powerful conclusion to this divine promise in verse 22. It solidifies everything. Reading from the NIV again. "As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease."
So after promising no more destruction, God gives this positive guarantee: stability, predictability, order.
Seed time and harvest, cold and heat. It covers everything, doesn't it?
It does. It's a literary device called a merism, using pairs of opposites to signify totality. It encompasses all the essential cycles of time and seasons that life, especially agricultural life, depends on. The promise of cosmic regularity.
And you mentioned the Hebrew word for cease, shenex to Shabbat, to rest.
Yes, that's a fascinating insight. The root is the same. It suggests that the chaotic disruption of the flood is over, and God is now establishing a state of enduring cosmic rest or stability. The violent interruptions are finished.
For people who had just lived through the ultimate chaos, the ultimate interruption, this promise of predictable order must have been, well, everything.
Absolutely fundamental. Think about it from their perspective. Chaos was the ultimate fear in the ancient world. The flood was chaos incarnate. John Walton stresses that this promise is God committing to maintain order and regularity.
Which allows civilization to even be possible again. Planting, building.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Without that basic trust in the cycles, how could you rebuild? How could you plant crops? This promise provides immense comfort, security. It allows humanity to move forward without the constant dread of another annihilating flood.
This really brings us to that theological concept we hear about common grace. Can you unpack that in light of this verse?
Certainly. Alan Ross and others connect this directly to common grace. It's the idea that God extends his sustaining, benevolent grace to all of humanity and indeed all of creation, universally, regardless of their relationship with him, regardless of their sin.
So this promise isn't just for Noah's family or Israel later on. It's for everyone.
Yes, it's God's universal commitment to uphold the basic conditions necessary for life itself to continue on Earth. Stable seasons, predictable weather patterns, the ability for the earth to produce food. This is God's kindness extended to all, even amidst ongoing human rebellion.
Wow. That means the very stability of the world, the fact that we can rely on sunrise, on seasons, is itself an act of God's continuous mercy.
Precisely. It's the silent, constant grace that underpins all existence, allowing societies to function, life to flourish, and crucially, allowing God's larger redemptive plan the time and space it needs to unfold throughout history.
So this promise provides that foundational security, not just for survival, but for rebuilding, for having hope for the future, right?
Absolutely. Imagine the psychological relief, stepping onto a silent, devastated earth. This promise changes everything. It means you can plant, you can build, you can have children with the confidence that the basic world order won't collapse again through divine judgment. It provides a stable stage for everything that follows human history. God's covenant, salvation itself, is the essential backdrop.
Okay, we've covered the basics of the text, but now let's really peel back some layers. Scholars offer some truly fascinating insights that go deeper, perspectives that might make you pause and think, wow, I never saw it that way before. These are the kinds of aha moments that really enrich our understanding. Let's explore some of those now.
Yes, let's. Because Noah's sacrifice, while seemingly straightforward, is packed with layers of meaning when you dig into the context and the theology. It's much more than just saying thank you.
Right. Gordon Wenham emphasizes gratitude, which is obviously huge. But what other motivations or meanings do scholars suggest might be going on here? It must have been such an emotionally charged moment.
Well, Kenneth Matthews offers a really interesting idea. He suggests in the NAC that maybe Noah intended the sacrifice partly to atone for or redeem the land itself.
Redeem the land? How so?
Well, think about it. The ground was cursed because of human sin, then devastated by the flood. So the sacrifice could be seen almost as a rededication ceremony for the cleansed earth, seeking God's blessing to make it fruitful again, to remove that lingering sense of curse.
A prayer for the restoration of creation itself, not just humanity. That's powerful. What about the cultural context? Sacrifices in the ancient Near East often had a different function, didn't they? Like appeasing angry gods.
That's a key point James McCown brings up in his commentary. While we rightly emphasize God's grace being proactive in the Bible, God acting first out of his own nature, we can't ignore the cultural air Noah breathed.
So in that world, people often sacrificed to calm down angry deities.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
And objectively speaking, Noah's sacrifice is followed by God's pleasing aroma and his promise not to destroy again. So while God wasn't coerced from a human or cultural perspective at the time, there might well have been an element of hoping to appease God's righteous anger, to ensure his favor moving forward.
It shows how human understanding and divine reality can interact in complex ways. And the act of building the altar itself, you mentioned John Walton's perspective on that.
Yes, Walton's temple theology idea is fascinating here. In ancient thinking, altars or temples weren't just places to do rituals. They were often seen as the cosmic center point, the axis mundi, connecting heaven and earth.
The stabilizing point for the whole cosmos.
In a sense, yes. So in a world thrown into absolute chaos, desacralized by the flood, Noah building this altar is a profoundly symbolic act. He's reestablishing sacred space. He's reasserting God's reign over this new world, recentering creation around his presence.
Like planting God's flag in the new world, saying this is his.
Exactly. A declaration of divine sovereignty over the renewed creation.
And let's not forget the sheer human emotion. Victor Hamilton talks about this, right? The fear and uncertainty Noah must have felt.
Oh, absolutely. Hamilton paints a vivid picture in NICOT. Imagine stepping out onto that silent, desolate, debris-strewn earth. The uncertainty, the fear of what comes next must have been overwhelming.
So the sacrifice wasn't just looking back and thanks.
No, it was also intensely forward-looking, a desperate plea perhaps for security, for provision in this strange new landscape, for assurance that they could actually survive and rebuild. It was an act of profound faith and dependence in the face of immense existential dread.
We talked about the pleasing aroma, but maybe we can go even deeper. It seems like such a simple phrase, but theologically it carries so much weight.
It really does. It distinguishes the God of the Bible so clearly, and it points towards some foundational truths about relationship and redemption.
You mentioned it symbolizes restored fellowship. Can you expand on that? Why is restoration the key idea here?
Well, Alan Ross emphasizes this. Sin had caused this massive rupture between God and humanity, leading to the flood. The pleasing aroma signifies God's acceptance of Noah's worship, yes, but more deeply, his active desire to bridge that gap, to restore the relationship.
So it's God signaling his willingness to reconnect, to draw near again after the judgment.
Precisely. It's like a divine nod, an open door back into fellowship, initiated by God in response to humble, grateful worship. It's God delighting not in the smell of burning flesh, but in the scent of a restored connection with his creation.
And you contrasted this sharply with Gilgamesh earlier. Can we revisit that? Noam Sarna's point about Yahweh's transcendence versus those needy gods seems critical.
It is critical. Sarna really highlights the difference. In Gilgamesh, the gods are needy, hungry, almost frantic, swarming the sacrifice like flies. It's a picture of dependence.
Almost undignified.
Very much so. But Genesis portrays Yahweh as completely transcendent, self-sufficient. He doesn't need this sacrifice for sustenance. His positive response, spoken in his heart, comes from his own sovereign grace and character. It underscores his majesty, his moral uprightness, his sheer otherness compared to pagan deities. He chooses relationship, he delights in it, but he isn't dependent on our offerings for his being.
That distinction is fundamental. Now, from a Christian perspective, how does Noah's sacrifice point forward? You mentioned prefigurement.
Yes, this is classic Christian interpretation going back centuries, highlighted by reformers like Calvin. Noah's sacrifice, while genuinely pleasing in its context, was ultimately a shadow. Like all Old Testament sacrifices, it couldn't perfectly or permanently deal with sin.
It was temporary, symbolic.
Yeah, exactly. It prefigured, it pointed towards the one ultimate perfect sacrifice, Jesus Christ on the cross. Ephesians 5.2 even uses similar language, calling Christ's giving a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God.
So Noah's offering was accepted because it anticipated Christ's.
That's the theological understanding. It foreshadowed the one perfect offering that would truly satisfy divine justice and bring about ultimate, lasting reconciliation. Our worship today is pleasing only through Christ's perfect sacrifice.
And Gordon Wenham mentioned a connection between sacrifice and covenant making in the ancient world. How might Noah's Ark fit into that?
Wenham suggests that while Noah's sacrifice wasn't the covenant ceremony itself, that comes in chapter 9 with the rainbow, it created the right atmosphere.
A sacred context.
Precisely. In that ancient mindset, sacrifice often accompanied or preceded covenant agreements. Noah's act of worship created this receptive, sacred space that, in a sense, prompted God to articulate the covenant promise he already intended to make in his heart. It set the stage for the formal covenant establishment in Genesis 9.
That makes sense. It prepares the ground, so to speak. Now, maybe the most profound point, God's decision not to destroy again, despite knowing human nature hasn't changed. This paradox seems central.
It is central, Dora. It's challenging, but it reveals something incredibly crucial about God's character and how he chooses to relate to his flawed creation.
You use Claus Westerman's term, divine self-limitation. Can you unpack that a bit more? What exactly is God limiting?
Westerman suggests God willingly chooses to constrain his own power, specifically his power to execute immediate, comprehensive judgment for sin, like the flood. He doesn't change his assessment of sin. He knows the heart is still evil.
But he changes his response. He limits his reaction.
Exactly. He limits his immediate destructive response in order to sustain creation. It's an act of profound grace where his mercy and long-term redemptive purpose override his immediate righteous anger against sin. It allows history and his plan to continue.
So Gordon Wenham's idea of God adopting a new policy fits right in here.
Perfectly. Wenham argues the flood taught a crucial lesson. Total destruction doesn't eradicate sin's root in the human heart. So God implements a new approach.
A policy based not on human improvement, but on
his own unchanging character, his faithfulness, his long-suffering. He commits to sustaining the world based on his own gracious decision, not on our performance. It's a policy of sustained grace rather than repeated cataclysm.
And again, that hinges on understanding key as despite, right? Because if it meant because, the whole logic falls apart.
Absolutely. Walton and others stress this. Despite the fact that the heart is evil, it highlights the radical, unmerited nature of God's grace. It's not that our sinfulness somehow earns mercy, it's that God chooses mercy even though sin persists. Getting that nuance right is vital for preaching true grace.
And how does this new policy, this self-limitation, become a necessary step for salvation history itself?
Well, as Kenneth Matthews argues, think about it. Without this fundamental commitment from God to sustain the world and not wipe it out repeatedly, how could any of the later stages of redemption happen?
The calling of Abraham, the Exodus, the coming of Christ.
None of it. There'd be no stable stage, no continuity. This promise in Genesis 8 provides the necessary backdrop, the guaranteed stability across time, for God's entire plan of salvation, culminating in Jesus, to unfold patiently through the generations. It's the prerequisite for everything else.
Okay, let's dig into a few more really unique scholarly insights. These are perspectives that add fresh color and depth, maybe things we don't often consider.
Yes, these really bring out the richness, like Walton's idea about the altar we touched on earlier.
Right, the altar is more than just a place to sacrifice. Expand on that idea of it being the new world's center point.
Walton draws on ancient cosmology, where temples or key altars were seen as the axis mundi, the navel of the world, the connection point between heaven and earth, ensuring cosmic order.
So Noah building the altar wasn't just personal piety.
Walton argues it was a cosmic act. In a world washed clean by chaos, Noah is symbolically reestablishing divine order. He's planting God's presence firmly at the center of this new beginning, declaring Yahweh's kingship over the renewed creation. It's about recentering the world around God.
A powerful symbolic statement. Then there was that linguistic connection you mentioned between God's promise in 8.22, never cease, and Shabbat, or rest. Tell us more about that connection.
Victor Hamilton points out the verb hut, to cease, to rest, used for never cease, shares the root with Shabbat. He suggests the flood was the ultimate disruption, the ultimate divine agitation of creation's order.
So God's promise is to bring creation back into a state of rest.
Stability.
Yes, a state of enduring stability, where the natural rhythms won't be violently overthrown again. It links God's promise here back to the themes of creation and Sabbath rest, suggesting a restoration of dependable order after the chaos. It's a beautiful connection between judgment, rest, and recreation. Incredible. Now, that concept of the evil inclination, the yar, we usually focus on the negative, evil from childhood. But Nahum Sarna hinted at a more nuanced view from later Jewish thought.
Right. Sarna points out that later rabbis developed the idea of two inclinations, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and the Yetzer Hataf, the good inclination.
So the inclination itself isn't inherently evil, but it got corrupted.
Sarna implies Genesis might hint at this. The Yer itself might be a God-given drive or force, maybe neutral initially, but deeply corrupted by the fall, hence predominantly bent towards evil now.
So God's grace isn't just about overlooking the evil, but maybe redirecting that drive.
Potentially, yes. The hope in later thought is that this powerful drive can, through God's work and human effort aligned with God's will, be restrained and ultimately channeled towards good. It offers a more dynamic view, not just total depravity, but a corrupted potential that grace can begin to redeem and redirect.
That adds a fascinating layer of complexity and hope. Finally, there's that beautiful poetic insight from James McCune comparing the regular cycles of nature in 8.22 to daily rainbows. What's the idea there?
McCune's insight is just lovely. He suggests, if the rainbow in Genesis 9 is the occasional, dramatic sign of God's covenant promise,
Appearing after a storm?
then the constant, reliable cycles of day and night, seed time and harvest, summer and winter promised here in 8.22 are like daily signs of that same faithfulness.
So every sunrise, every season change is a quiet reminder.
Exactly. They become constant, tangible affirmations that God's promise holds, that His common grace endures. It turns the ordinary, predictable world around us into a perpetual witness to God's unfailing commitment. It helps us see His faithfulness not just in the spectacular, but in the steadfast rhythms of everyday existence.
Okay, we've explored so many deep theological and scholarly insights. Now, the really crucial question, especially for those of us in ministry or seeking to live out our faith, what does all this mean for us today? How do these ancient truths speak into our lives, our pulpits, our pastoral care right now?
Well, Noah's immediate response, that spontaneous act of worship right after deliverance, that sets such a powerful example, doesn't it? It speaks volumes about where worship should sit in our priorities.
It really does. His first recorded act, not building shelter, not planting crops, but building an altar. Gordon Wenham calls it a paradigm for believers. So how can we, especially as pastors, cultivate that same spirit of spontaneous, genuine gratitude in our congregations? How do we move beyond just Sunday morning routine?
I think it starts with constantly reminding ourselves and our people of God's deliverance, both the big ultimate deliverance in Christ and the smaller daily rescues and provisions. Cultivating hearts that recognize God's grace.
So encouraging people to actually count their blessings, to remember God's specific acts.
Yes, actively recalling and celebrating His mercies. Then, our teaching and preaching can aim to inspire that burnt offering response, offering our best, our whole selves, our time, talents, resources, not out of duty, but as a joyful, complete surrender, mirroring Noah. It's about fostering a heart response, not just fulfilling an obligation.
Moving from attendance to genuine offering. Now, maybe the tougher truth. God's decision to sustain the world despite knowing sin remains deeply ingrained. Evil from childhood.
Yeah, that's challenging, but also incredibly liberating, I think. The passage forces us to confront the stubborn reality of sin. Even the flood didn't eradicate it from the human heart.
What does that mean for our view of humanity in ministry? It seems pretty sobering.
It means we need a realistic, theologically grounded view of human nature. We can't be naive about sin's power or persistence. Acknowledging this depravity is actually foundational for appreciating the magnitude of God's grace. You can't understand the cure if you don't understand the disease, right?
True. It guards against cheap grace and highlights our constant need for God.
Exactly. But then comes the counterintuitive grace. God's response isn't more judgment, but this steadfast commitment, this divine self-limitation Westerman talks about.
Yeah.
How does that empower ministry, especially when we see struggles, failures, slow growth?
It has to offer immense comfort, doesn't it? Knowing God's grace persists even when we fail, even when progress feels slow.
Tremendous comfort and resilience.
Yeah.
It assures us that God's commitment isn't based on our success or rapid improvement. Our continued existence, the world's stability, it all rests on His unilateral mercy.
So for pastors, it informs how we preach forgiveness, how we practice patience, how we understand our own ongoing need for mercy.
Absolutely. It frees us from the pressure of demanding instant perfection from ourselves or others. It grounds our ministry in God's relentless grace, reminding us to be patient because He is incredibly patient with us. It shapes our expectations in a realistic, grace-filled way.
Then there's God's promise about the natural order, seed time and harvest, day and night will never cease. That provides a deep security.
Yes, that promise of stable cycles is God's common grace, as Alan Ross points out. And in our modern world, which also feels so chaotic and unpredictable.
With climate change anxieties, economic uncertainty, personal crises.
Right. In the midst of all that, this promise becomes a profound anchor. It assures us there's a fundamental order, a dependable rhythm upheld by God Himself beneath all the surface turmoil.
It's God's hand quietly sustaining the world. How can pastors help people really grab hold of that promise, especially when their personal world feels like it's falling apart?
We can intentionally highlight those daily signs of faithfulness McKeown talked about, teaching people to see God's dependable care, not just in extraordinary events, but in the ordinary, reliable rhythms of creation, the sunrise, the seasons, the provision of food.
Finding stability in the mundane because God upholds it.
Exactly. It offers a powerful antidote to anxiety. It grounds our hope not in shifting circumstances, but in the unwavering character of the God who keeps the cosmos running according to his faithful promise.
Finally, Noah's sacrifice itself. While pleasing to God, it points beyond itself, doesn't it?
It does. We have to remember that all Old Testament sacrifices, including Noah's, were ultimately temporary and symbolic. They couldn't provide the final perfect solution to sin.
They were foreshadows, imperfect pointers.
Yes, they pointed forward to the greater reality, the ultimate sacrifice.
Which is Christ. How does understanding Christ as the fulfillment change how we view Noah's act in all OT sacrifice?
It elevates Christ's work infinitely. Theologians like Calvin emphasize that Noah's sacrifice was pleasing precisely because it prefigured Christ's perfect once-for-all sacrifice. Christ fulfilled what those earlier sacrifices only symbolized. His death is the better sacrifice that truly atones and reconciles.
So understanding this fulfillment is key for preaching the cross effectively today.
Absolutely crucial. It establishes Christ's completed work as the sole basis for our acceptance with God. Our worship, our service, our prayers today, they are acceptable, they are fragrant offerings, only because we offer them in Christ.
For his merit, not our own.
Exactly. It gives us a thoroughly Christocentric view of worship and access to God. The cross isn't just history. It's the present reality through which we approach the Father. Hashtag 50, summary and conclusion.
So wrapping up our journey through Genesis 8.20-22. It's such a pivotal passage, isn't it? Taking us from the devastation of the flood right into the heart of God's enduring grace.
It really is. We saw Noah's immediate spontaneous worship setting this incredible precedent for how humanity responds to God's deliverance.
And then, maybe even more strikingly, God's astonishing decision made in his heart to sustain a world he knew was still deeply flawed, revealing his incredible patience, his self-limiting grace, his faithfulness as the very foundation of our ongoing existence.
Yeah, the focus really shifts dramatically from human failure, which was a reason for the flood, to God's unwavering character and his unilateral promises as the reason for hope and continuity.
So the key takeaway for us, especially as leaders, maybe it starts with gratitude. Like Noah, our response to God, our ministry, it has to flow from that deep well of thankfulness for his rescue, his grace.
Absolutely. But then also, like God in this passage, we're called to embody that same kind of radical, persistent grace towards others, towards a world we know is broken, yet is sustained daily by his faithfulness.
Which means our message can't just be about sin, right? It has to be equally, if not more powerfully, about the triumph of God's covenant faithfulness and the perfection, the completion, found only in Christ's sacrifice, which truly deals with sin and offers real transformation.
Well said. Gratitude driving our worship, and God's persistent grace shaping our ministry. Hashtag V, Faith Reflection for Pastors.
As we close this deep dive, here's something specific for you to reflect on, especially in the context of your own ministry. Considering God's incredible patience revealed here, his self-limitation, his commitment to sustaining this flawed world from childhood, what does this profound revelation about common grace and God's enduring faithfulness call you to, personally, in your pastoral approach?
That's a great question to wrestle with.
Yeah, how might you more deeply live out and preach God's steadfast grace, especially when you're face to face with the stubborn realities of human brokenness, or maybe the frustratingly slow pace of spiritual growth in your people or community?
It really pushes us, doesn't it? Think about how that divine shift from immediate judgment to sustained grace shapes your resilience in ministry, your approach to long-term discipleship. How do you, as a leader, actively embody that new policy of grace in your daily interactions, your planning, your preaching?
Especially when confronted by those cycles of sin or apparent lack of progress.
Exactly. It's about mirroring his divine patience, consciously recognizing his sustaining hand, even in the ordinary day-to-day stuff, and always pointing people back to Christ, the one who perfectly fulfills this gracious covenant and makes true, lasting transformation possible within God's patient-sustaining framework. Hashtag outro.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Genesis 8. We really pray this exploration has sparked fresh insights and brought renewed encouragement for your walk and your ministry.
Yes, keep digging into God's word with that same curiosity and hunger for truth. Let it shape you. Until next time, may you experience deeply and proclaim boldly the incredible, enduring faithfulness of our God.